Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 10th episode of the podcast GeoFinance. Ivan and Dragan will be your hosts for tonight. As usual, the topic for today is power. And the question is, who has more power nowadays? Is it multinationals or is it the state? We have plenty of examples from the history to draw upon, and we can also use the current situation to see if this debate can reach any conclusion. Hello, Ivan, how are you doing?
I'm great, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Okay, you're very welcome. Can you please open this episode by drawing some examples from the history and companies such as East India Company or similar example that we have and their influence in politics and economics a couple of centuries ago?
Well, there were several East India companies. There was the British
That's
East India
true.
companies, the British East India Company. There was the Dutch East India Company, the well-known VOC. There were Danish East India companies. Other countries also had East India companies. So these companies were effectively monopolies on the trade of spices from India and China and the Indonesia region. A lot of spices was traded from there to Europe. It was very lucrative. These companies made a lot of money, and as their power grew, as their profits grew, they had increasingly more power. They effectively started building colonies, building settlements. They had their own armies. Some of them issued their own money. So VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was actually the largest company in the history of the world. It's a good point to make that these companies were as powerful European states. The Dutch Golden Age, for example, in the 17th century, it was marked very much by VOC. It was marked very much by Dutch trade. Other countries were also engaged in trade in a similar fashion. Other countries had other trading companies. For example, the Russian American company. It was mostly Alaska. But the company used to trade pelts, for example. There were other companies as well. So it's not just the spice trade, but these companies were set up so that these colonies or these territories can be administered without too much government oversight, but they grew in power over time.
So what do you think? How did they manage to amass so much power? Was it like some kind of extension of the government, some extension of the state, or they simply had a combination of a bit of luck, a bit of business feeling, a bit of something else? Or was it like some kind of support by the state that was the primary drive?
Well, they had something that the state didn't have at the time. They had money. Specifically, they could draw in investors from the mother country, from the mother state, because these companies, while they were founded by the states, they were not owned or completely owned by the states. There were investors, private investors from those countries that could invest their funds in these companies, and they could draw dividends from the profits of these companies. So that in large part that enabled these companies to grow so large because they had a lot of money.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the Dutch example, their company was actually the inventor of shareholding system, so they say in some kind of articles.
The Dutch were ahead of everyone else in terms of finance, in terms of the sophisticated economic instruments, for example, and this created bubbles. This created the tulip mania, for example, but this also created a sense of possibility to make money from money. This is a capitalistic approach to business and to the world. So investors, finally, people who were rich, people who were who were well standing, they could invest their money in a way that didn't involve them actively farming. For example, farming was throughout history, farming was the main source of income for people, and these medieval European nobility and wealthy people, they owned a lot of farmland. Farmland was expensive, and they earned money from that farmland. But that also required a lot of management, also required a lot of their time. And with the arrival of this opportunity in the Netherlands at first, and then it spread elsewhere, to invest money in a company which then earned money and paid back dividends, this was fabulous for these people because they could earn money doing nothing.
Mm-hmm. All right, good. Let's jump to our present day, so to speak. There are three megatrends, according to some sources. The first megatrend is the collapse of the Soviet Union that had changed the politics irreversibly. The second is the innovation in supply chain management. And the third is the exponential growth in technology. So those are, according to some sources, trends that shape our understanding of the current world and development in business. So let's speak about this technological development, improvements in technology, and let's try to make a parallel with the companies that we just mentioned, translated to big tech companies, to technological behemoths, so to speak, nowadays. Can you see some kind of pattern there? Can you see something that might connect those two periods in history, today with the past?
First, I have to comment on the the technological development that you mentioned. I actually think that we haven't really developed that much technologically, not as much as we might have. Imagine someone in 1900. Most people didn't have electricity. Most people didn't have radio. Many people were illiterate. People were dirt poor. Just 60, 70 years later, people had landed on the moon. Everyone had TVs. Everyone was living relatively comfortably in the West, I mean. And then from the 60s until now, not much has changed. I mean, some things have changed, of course. In terms of computers, things have changed, smart devices, smartphones, etc. But normal life has changed in a way, but it's different. It's more of a slow evolution rather than technological revolutions. And so I don't think that technology itself, obviously there is, it does play a very important role, but I don't think technology itself has progressed so much that it has changed everything.
Mm-hmm.
What is about to happen technologically will change everything, and that will be AI, general purpose AI. But so far, I don't think technology has changed that drastically. However, in terms of the demise of the former Soviet Union, that did affect everything. But again, that wasn't a major thing because the Soviet Union wasn't, it was a major world power in terms of its military, in terms of weapons, but it wasn't a major world power in terms of economics.
Definitely not. Yeah.
So after the fall of the Soviet Union, the West kind of didn't know who its enemy was. Western powers were feeling very, very confident, very sure of themselves for about a decade until 9/11 happened, and then they refocused on Islamic terrorism as their enemy. Although I'm not really sure that's sincere. I think that's just a plot to sell weapons. And what was the third?
The second was the innovation in supply chain, let's say globalization.
Oh yeah, globalization is actually the biggest factor here because 50 years ago or 100 years ago, most countries produced most of their own products, and now that's not really the case. I mean, grab any product around you. Most of the products are not made in your country. Most products are made in Asia or elsewhere where labor is cheaper, where there is less regulation, where there is less oversight, where governments are prone to taking bribes, etc. So most of the things that you see around you probably, I'm looking at a computer screen, it's probably made in China. I'm looking at a keyboard, it's probably made in China. looking at my phone or my mouse, speakers, all of that's probably made in China. So actually, the speakers are made in Denmark, but that's beside the point.
Okay.
That's beside the point because most things are made in China. And the globalization was a major event over the past, say, 30 years. Was the major event here. And it would have happened even if the Soviet Union remained intact.
All right. To ask something a bit bluntly, do you think that China is more powerful than Google nowadays, or vice versa?
China is definitely more powerful than Google.
Why?
Because China is a real country. China is a country of 1.3, 1.4 billion people, and it does not depend on Google at all. Google has a lot more power in the West. Google has a lot more power in shaping public opinion, for example, in Europe, in North America, not so much in China. China survives without Google. Effectively, Chinese companies, the Chinese model is for Chinese companies to copy Western companies and create services for their own markets, and also services that their government can control. So this has been a trend in China, and you see companies such as Weibo, such as Tencent. So I don't think that Google is more powerful than the Chinese government. However, it is more powerful than some governments, smaller countries, governments, especially in the West, where Google has a lot of influence. Because Google can shape public opinion. Google does control YouTube. Google does control search. Google has a lot of services. Gmail. Google can spy on a lot of people if it wants to. But I don't think Google is more powerful than the Chinese government or the U.S. government or the Russian government. These governments are more powerful than any company or any amalgamation of companies.
I see. So you think that great powers nowadays and their states are still far more powerful than big companies that are very influential, despite the debate that companies that have big revenues and big influence can outmatch the great powers, the traditional great powers, so to speak.
Well, look at it this way. For example, 10 years ago or more than 10 years ago, you had GPS in your phones, right? In your phone, in your devices. But now you have GPS, you have GLONASS, the Russian system, you have COMPASS, that's the Chinese system, you have the Galileo, that's the EU system. This all started with Russia. Russia said, if you don't include the Russian system, we're going to introduce tariffs of, 100%, 200% on every device imported into Russia that doesn't have GLONASS. And every manufacturer said, sure, fine, we'll just add GLONASS because that's the much cheaper
solution. Yes.
Solution. And these big countries, they're big markets. They have a lot of consumers. They have a lot of people. They have a lot of purchasing power. They can shape what companies do in a lot of ways. Russia, for example, has banned LinkedIn from operating in Russia because, according to Russian law, information on Russian citizens has to be stored within Russia. And LinkedIn did not comply with that, so Russia just banned access to LinkedIn. So these countries do have the ability to blackmail these companies. They have the ability to force these companies to do things that they want. And this is the reality. However, smaller countries don't have as much power. If a small European country wanted something from Google, I don't think that would affect Google's behavior that much.
I see. What about the other big companies that are having big revenues that are not necessarily tech companies? Do they have much more influence towards event? Do they have more bargaining power than some, let's say, second order powers states that are not the first tier in terms of power? What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, sure. And in many ways they do, because, for example, I read somewhere that about half of the world's hazelnuts are used by the company Ferrero for their Nutella products.
Really?
That's a lot of hazelnuts. So obviously, if one company consumes half of the world's hazelnuts, then they have enormous power, a lot of power over producers. They can blackmail producers. They can force producers to to alter their product in ways that benefit them. So there are many such examples in the world. I think these companies have some power over some countries, but I think that in terms of power, yeah, tech companies such as Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, they have a lot of power because they have a lot of information. Facebook has information on everyone, or almost everyone. Billions of people are Facebook members, or I guess have Facebook profiles. Billions of people use Google every day. Billions of people order from Amazon or through Amazon. There are hundreds of millions of Apple product users. That's a lot of people, and so these companies have a lot of sway over countries and over their users, for example, which translates in power over countries, especially as you said, second-rate countries.
I see. What do you predict? Because many sources claim that the nation state is like outdated model of functioning, and yet we have this situation with this coronavirus that puts a bit more emphasis on the possible rise of nationalism, possible empowerment of the national state. What do you predict? How things would develop in terms of this relation and power play between the state and the companies? Will there be any changes that are going to significantly change? Significantly influence our lives?
I think that all of the changes that will take place will be towards sovereignism rather than internationalism over the next, say, decade or so, because many countries, especially with this crisis that we're in, many countries are trying to take back control, and they're doing it in many ways, including closing their borders. They remembered suddenly that they have borders. They include screening migrants, immigrants, not letting people in. This will have a profound effect. Also, many countries have realized that they don't really produce all of their goods domestically. They import a lot of stuff from China, and that makes them vulnerable. So many countries will force producers to come back to their country, to those countries, the countries of where the companies are registered, and produce their medication, for example, there, produce other goods there, and this will obviously affect mega corporations because mega corporations earn money from cheap labor in these jurisdictions, mostly in Asia. And if labor comes back, well, if production comes back, labor won't come back. But if production comes back, mostly automated production to the West, to more developed countries, then these companies will have some power, but it won't be nearly as much as they do now. Because if, for example, a company is producing something domestically, the government can just confiscate whatever they're producing. The government has enormous power over it. If a company is multinational, if a company is, for example, it's theoretically an American company, but it produces everything in China, and if the government tries to force them to do something, they can always just say, screw you guys, and we'll just operate outside the US. And if there's a deglobalization, companies will return back to their home countries, and this will not be possible, at least for a while. Also, I see a bit of a merger between companies and the states.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning the states already have a lot of power over these companies, and they are forcing companies to spy on people on their behalf. They're forcing these companies to give them information even without warrants. They have enormous power over these companies, and these companies comply. And so it's kind of, if one tries to define it's most similar to fascism, the merger of government and private business, because the government controls so much and the private business controls so much, but if they merged, they would be able to control everything.
That doesn't sound so good.
It doesn't, but there are, for now, ways to work outside that system. But if companies talk governments into introducing social credit scores, for example, facial recognition software. Companies are making that. Companies are selling the devices and the software to the government. So that could be a combination of their powers, of government power and corporate power, and that may lead to not desirable outcomes.
Okay. Instead of conclusion, do you think that we would need some kind of different social contract between the state and its citizens soon?
I don't know. This is a very difficult question to answer, because what will happen is there will be a lot of long-term unemployment because of this crisis, because of the coming AI crisis, and governments will have a lot more pressure put on them to solve some of these issues, to provide employment to their citizens, to force companies to hire citizens, or to pay higher and higher taxes. And companies will respond by moving to other jurisdictions, offshore jurisdictions, just closing down. And I don't know what will happen. I don't think UBI is a good, universal basic income is a good idea. I think actually it's a horrible idea. But I don't know what else to suggest. Certainly, I'm deep down, I'm a capitalist libertarian, so I don't like the government intervening too much in anyone's affairs. I think the taxes should be minimal. I think that the government should not be too big. And now we will have the option of reducing the size of government through technology, because when general purpose AI comes, it will be easy, it will be trivial to just replace 95% of government employees with computers. So that's one option. That's one possible outcome. But also, private companies will also replace much of their workforce with computers. So that will lead to increased efficiency, absolutely, but also a lot of people will be unemployed. And I'm especially talking about, for up until now, every single technological revolution meant that a lot of people became unemployed. But this one is different, because this one will make white-collar workers, educated workers, intelligent people unemployed. That is a big problem. And I'm not sure that I see a solution to this problem so far.
All right. Sounds a bit scary and promising at the same time, as many things generally are. Good. Then, Ivan, I would like to thank you for your precious comments, and I hope that we are going to speak relatively soon about other things. And until then, stay healthy and best of luck. All right?
Likewise.
Thank you very much. Dear listeners, thank you for being with us today, and good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.